That's a question each member of the shadow cabinet will have to come to. What I can tell you is that over 40 Labour councillors across the UK have resigned. Large numbers of grassroots members are resigning. There is talk of at least 4 frontbenchers potentially about to resign, and countless number of MPs. The reason I understand, having spoken to some of these individuals and hearing from people in the wider Labour Party, is they have tried to see whether by remaining in the party they can influence things. Now they need to understand that they have a leader who has significant disregard for human life and international law, and they must reconcile with themselves whether they feel in good conscience they can remain in a party where the leadership takes that position.
The Keir Starmer speech, sort of setting out properly rather than in bits of interviews and briefings and so on. Is there anything that he said in that speech there that would tempt you to rejoin Labour?
No, I don't think so. I think it's been a long time since I've heard a speech from a leading politician that's been quite so tone deaf, if I'm honest. We know that from national polls, over 3/4 of the British population support a ceasefire. Half his front bench supports a ceasefire. We've had the London mayor, the Greater Manchester mayor, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, all come out and call for a ceasefire. He really is quite out of touch, and I think the issue is that a lot of people will listen to this speech and hear it as nothing more than empty rhetoric. He said within the speech that the problem with a ceasefire is it would leave things where they are. Yes, the leading aid agencies in Gaza state that at least 10,000 people have died in Gaza already, over half of whom are children. And I think the other bigger problem really that he has not explained is he talked about practical steps. Well, the reason all the leading aid agencies in Gaza are calling for a ceasefire rather than a humanitarian pause is because it's not clear what a humanitarian pause means. It's welcome that any cessation in hostilities should be welcome, but how long will that pause be for? How many people will you feed before you start bombing them again? And there's absolute devastation going on in Gaza at the moment, and we must call for an immediate ceasefire. We must also remember that this is a population where 450 lorries of aid used to be delivered on a daily basis prior to these events over the last few weeks. 80% of the population in Gaza relies on humanitarian aid in quote unquote normal times. So this is more than just a slight reduction in the amount of aid they're getting. It's an absolute catastrophe.
But I suppose,
and I think really.
Let me just jump in because I'm conscious of a huge amount of time. But I suppose Keir Starmer is approaching this as, this time next year he could be Prime Minister. To some extent, he's approaching this looking at it's an incredibly complicated situation, and Israel's right to defend itself and to react to the Hamas terror attack is a right that he supports. And he will be thinking, Keir Starmer could be Prime Minister on the receiving end of a terror attack, and Britain would want to be able to respond to that, and people in the UK wouldn't be calling for a ceasefire in that situation. So can you understand why Keir Starmer is in this situation, that he actually, maybe it's a sign of not being tone deaf, but being braver than perhaps some politicians, that he's not looking at the polls, he's looking at maybe what he considers the right thing to do in reality, rather than a world where everyone could just get on?
Well, to the contrary, there are more calls for a ceasefire coming from Israel than there are in the UK from leading politicians. So actually, I don't think it's true that the call for a humanitarian pause is the right thing to do. And as I say, over 3/4 of the British population aren't calling for, are wanting a full ceasefire rather than a humanitarian pause. What Keir Starmer needs to answer, and to be honest, it's welcome that his position has shifted quite significantly on this already to some extent. In the early days, of course, he was asked whether he supported a siege on Gaza, to which he answered yes. I know he came back to say that he was answering a different question, but we've all heard the interview. It took him 9 days to issue that clarification, which really is quite meaningful. Israel does have a right to defend itself, but it must be in line with international law. And all the leading international law experts are clear that there is currently collective punishment being meted out. There is displacement of civilians in Gaza. Over 50% of houses in Gaza have been destroyed. This is not targeting a terrorist organization. Palestinians are not all Hamas, and all Hamas do not represent all Palestinians. And the question Keir Starmer needs to answer, if he continues to call for a humanitarian pause, is how many Palestinian children does he feel need to die before he will call for a ceasefire? We already have over 5,000, and it's disingenuous of him to say that every Palestinian life matters when he says he's in favor of continuing the status quo and allowing that level of killing and devastation to continue.
Just finally, before I let you go, Amar, what's your message to those members of Keir Starmer's front bench, the members of the shadow cabinet, who have some have spoken out, some haven't? Do you think that they should remain in his shadow cabinet if they disagree with this policy?
Well, I think that's a question each member of the shadow cabinet will have to come to. What I can tell you is that over 40 Labour councillors across the UK have resigned. Large numbers of grassroots members are resigning. There is talk of at least 4 frontbenchers potentially about to resign, and countless number of MPs. The reason I understand, having spoken to some of these individuals and hearing from people in the wider Labour Party, is they have tried to see
Yeah.
whether by remaining in the party they can influence things. Now they need to understand that they have a leader who has significant disregard for human life and international law, and they must reconcile with themselves whether they feel in good conscience they can remain in a party where the leadership takes that position.
Thanks so much for that. There's Amar Latif there, a former Labour councillor in Oxford who has resigned over Keir Starmer's approach.